Hi, and welcome to the Selected Tech podcast, brought to you by a group of 4 MVPs doing webinars, sessions, and interviews on all things SharePoint, Office 365, and the Microsoft AI ecosystem. Their motto is learn, share, reuse. And here they are, Albert Jan, Rick, Stefan, and Tommy.
Good evening. Welcome back to another episode of Selected Tech. This time I'm doing the intro because Appy is going to do an entire session on the Azure, on the Microsoft CLI, but this time as an Azure Container instance, meaning that you containerized the Azure CLI, the Microsoft CLI, Microsoft 365 CLI. So I don't want to waste any more time. I just want to see how it works. Appy, can you show us, please? Because I'm very, very curious how it works.
I can definitely show stuff. So I've got no slides. I just got demos. Should be good.
Even better. Even better.
If all is good, you should be able to see my screen any second now. There we go. So you probably heard of the CLI for Microsoft 365. If you haven't, in 2 seconds, it allows you to manage your Microsoft 365 tenant or your SharePoint framework projects from any platform. So whether you're on Windows, macOS, or Linux, doesn't really matter. You can run scripts against that environment. So what I have is I'm running it locally. So if you install it, if you have installed it, you can run commands like M365 SPO sites lists. And what it will do is it will reach out to your tenant. I'm already signed in, so it knows what to do. But it will pick up all sites in my environment. So you can see here just a dummy tenant with some dummy content, some samples. Now, the cool thing about this is running on my device. It's already being signed in, and I can do things like delete sites, or I can set specific settings on my tenant. But one of the things you can use it for is writing your own reports. You could say, what are active sites, or what are active teams, or what are teams that are no longer used. So you can get a bunch of data out of your tenant. It's pretty much the same with PowerShell scripts. You can get the same reports. The major difference is that this is running cross-platform. Now, if you go to the GitHub site or the GitHub pages that we have, what we actually have is we have a bunch of sample scripts. And those sample scripts allow you to get started fairly quick. And we do have samples like one of the things we have is, I don't know, list app usage in Microsoft Teams. So you can get all the app usage in your Teams. Or you can list all tabs in Microsoft Teams in your tenant. So you can do things like sort of a report. Now, this would all still be running locally. What you can also do is we do provide you with a Docker container. So from the PHP CLI Microsoft 365, there is a Docker container that you can run locally. By running the Docker container, you don't need to install Node. You don't need to install the bits. You just need to pull the Docker container. Now, what is cool is you can run Docker containers in the Azure Container instance. And with that, you can come up with all kinds of fancy solutions where you would be able to run your scripts, your samples from your Azure Container instance, meaning that I run in the cloud, meaning that I can run an attendant, meaning that you don't have to do anything, you don't have to run any hardware, you can just spin up the container and even schedule the container, say, run it every night, run it every week, without having to do anything fancy there. So let me switch to my setup. I do have a resource group created. The resource group contains all the resources that I need. And the first thing that I will need is I will need a managed identity. I created a new managed identity because I need to run that Docker container using a managed identity. Now, this managed identity, it's a user-defined. You can also use a system-defined. It doesn't really matter, but you'll need to make sure that this managed identity that you create, that you can use that in your Azure Container instance. So it does have at least the required permissions to run the CLI for Microsoft 365. So if I pick this managed identities, if I go to my enterprise applications, I'm going to take a second to load. I can pick that managed identity. You will see that that managed identity is there. And if I go to the permissions, what I did is I gave it some permissions, so not everything. I give it only the site collection permissions, and I give it the both SharePoint and Microsoft Graph, meaning that I can now iterate to all the site collections in my tenant with this managed identity. If you are doing different things, let's say you want to list all flows or you want to do things with Yammer, you might need additional permissions added here. But for this use, I only wanted to do things with my sites. So managed identity is in place and it has the permissions. I can use it. Now, the next step is what I wanted to do is I want to create that Azure Container instance, but I need to orchestrate it somehow. I can use the Azure CLI to create stuff, but what I wanted to do is I want to do a scheduled report. So something I run every week or every day. So what I ended up with is I ended up with a logic app, and that logic app is actually orchestrating everything for me. So let me go to edit and walk you through the logic app before we run it. What we actually do is we have a HTTP trigger, but it could be a timer trigger or it could be any trigger that you like. Doesn't really matter what the trigger is, but you'll need some trigger to run it. Now, the second thing is I define two parameters, the container group name and the container name itself. There's no real reason to create it as a variable. You can just use it or type it in every time. I just wanted to run a bunch of tests. As you could see, I did at least 9 tests before it was working. So I ended up doing parameters for it, made it a little bit easier for me, but it's not required. Now, the next thing is there actually is a action, create or update a container group. And this is where the magic will be happening. So what I have is I have that container group. Let me open it. 1, 2, 3. There we go. And what it does is it allows you to create a new container group and specify all the things that you need. So the first thing that you'll need to specify is subscription ID, resource group. It needs to know where it will create stuff. Then you need to specify a name, because if you create a new container group, the name is required. You need to specify the location. And then in that container group, you can automatically create a container, hence the container name. You can specify where that container needs to come from. So this is actually coming from the Docker Hub, looking for the image M365 PnP Microsoft 365 latest. You can also get the beta from there if you want to get the beta. But what this will do is it will pick the latest at that point in time and pull it in. You need to specify the CPU and the memory usage. Now, I don't really need that much because I'm doing fairly easy stuff, but you can imagine if you're doing like really complex scripts where you lose a lot of memory. Let's say you're going to load in, I don't know, 1 million site collections and you're going to iterate over those 1 million site collections. You might need a little bit more memory than the 1.5 that I'm using here. Now, all the other options you can just leave blank. But what we need to do is we'll actually want to run a command. So what we're going to do is we're going to set the command segment, and we're going to do 2 segments, segment 1 and segment 2. The reason for that is that you cannot combine commands. So you cannot run actual commands from this interface. You can only run scripts. So what we do is we're going to load a sample bash script, and we're going to show you how you load that in. But we're just going to say, okay, segment 1 is bash, meaning that the container knows I'm going to execute a bash script, and the second segment is actually the script that will be executed. So this will run a test.sh file, meaning it will execute a bash script. Now, all these things can be left blank. We're going to ignore all these settings, but what we are going to use is we're going to use something called a container volume. So what we're doing, and this is where it gets slightly confusing, because you see that I'm mounting a volume and I'm giving it a path and a name. So repo1 and git repo. The thing is, before I can actually run this, I'll need to specify 2 other things. So what I'll need to specify the Git repository where it needs to look, and I'll need to specify the volume name. So if you're not doing this, then the top part where you're actually referring to that volume name and that mount path won't work. So what we do is we'll set that repository. What this will do is this will pull in that specific repository. Now, this is a public repository, so there is a major risk with this. It's a public repository, so if I would change the script on this public repository, it will automatically be pulled in and potentially hijack your tenant. So in a real-life demo scenario, you probably want to use a private repository, but for demo purposes, I'm just doing the public repository. And as you can see here, there is this test script, and the test script will do stuff as soon as you execute it. So that makes sense, I would say. Now, the second thing that I'll need to do is I'll need to make sure that there is a managed identity. And in order to set a managed identity, you can pick the user assigned, because we created a user assigned one. And what I'll need to do there is I'll need to paste in the JSON that defines that specific user identity. And the format is kind of weird, because if I would select this and remove this, if I hover over the actual format, you will see that it explains what the format should be, meaning is guest, subscription ID, resource group. But if you look closely, the format in here differs from the format that I'm actually pasting in. So the highlight is not the correct format. It just only points to this specific part, but that's not valid JSON. So it needs to be in the brackets because it's an array. Otherwise, it won't work. It took me like 2 hours to figure out why it wasn't working. In the end, it turned out that the user identity was not working. Now, the way to get this specific user identity is just go to either use the CLI to generate everything, or figure out that you'll need the subscription ID, you'll need the resource group name, and you need the user identity name. There is documentation on how to construct it, but easiest way for me, the way that I found it, was creating an Azure Container instance through the CLI, because then you get like direct feedback why things are not working. So once you have that, you can just get the ARM template and copy paste the content from there. Once you've done that like once, you get the gist and know how it works. Other interesting or important part is the restart policy. If you put a restart policy on failure and you make a screw up in the way you do things, that means that your container instance will forever stay in a loop trying to restart, potentially driving up costs. So if you're testing this and you keep it running, it could potentially be quite expensive, because failures are expensive in Azure. So you either want to put it on never or just on failure to see what's happening and then just wait. Now, what this does is this creates that container instance for you. So everything you need to know is in this part. Then the second thing you need to do in the Logic app is you want to poll whether things are correct. So you can do you can poll the container group whether if it's succeeded or not. If it's equal to succeeded, do things. If not, you can just keep pulling, get that data, and then again, if it succeeded, you want to get all the logs, or you want to delay another X period of time. So I'm just going to wait 10 seconds, and then I'm going to iterate over and over again to see what's happening. Then with the logs, what you can actually do is you can get that data and you could do things with the data. So in this demo, I'm not doing anything with the data. I'm just retrieving it, and I'm not doing anything with it. Once I have that data, I can delete the container group, because there's no reason to let my Docker container run while I'm already done. Now, these are all the steps that you'll need to take. There's one additional remark, and that is we'll need to make sure that our script is signed in. So if I go to the create or updated container group, what I can do is I can scroll all the way down and go to that, a little bit down, go to that managed identity. And here you see that I do have that managed identity. Now, in my script, what I need to do is I'll need to force the Docker container to run or authenticate with that managed identity. And as you can see here, the first line enforces that I'm logging in, and I'm using the auth type identity, pass in the username, and then the username. This is the actual ID of the managed identity. So if I go back to the properties in my enterprise applications, you will see that while it is loading in the properties, you will see that that ID, go application ID 07, and that matches the 07 of the username. Then what I can do is I can execute commands like SPO site classic list output JSON, and that will return it as JSON. Or I can do SPO site list output JSON. So I think I did list here. Yeah, SPO site list. So let me actually edit it right away. Ooh, okay. I'm not going to edit it. Apparently, I was signed out of GitHub, so I'm going to ignore that one. But what will happen is if I execute this logic app, so let's do that, see what happens. It will create a new Azure Container instance. It will make sure to spin up a container in that, pulling in the script and execute that script. So I'm going to press the run button if it's loading, because apparently I'm doing a demo because it's really slow today. There we go. So I can do the run trigger, and I can do manual because, well, I'm not going to do an actual HTTP trigger for this demo. There we go. Loading, loading, loading. It's going to take a second. It's still running. So what I can do is I can actually see what's happening. If you open the run, you get details on what's happening, how far it is. So I'm going to open it. Loading, loading. Loading some more. Like loading a lot. In the meantime, I'm already going to refresh my resource group to see if the container instance is actually coming already.
But I have a question in the meantime while we're waiting.
Sure.
You're using a managed identity. That means that no matter who's the user that triggers your flow, you always use the identity defined in Azure. So that's targeted for long-running governance jobs and not for get my latest documents, for example.
Yeah, so what you can imagine that we could do as well is we could hijack a user token and pass it on into the container. But in this sample, what I really wanted to achieve is a long-running operation scheduled, I don't know, weekly or monthly, get all sites, process all sites, do things. We've got customers who are saying, okay, I want to get a report of all the flows that we have, or all flows that are still running or are running really long, or, well, whatever you try to achieve. That's the scenario that you could tackle with this.
Yeah, like an admin user that sees everything.
Yeah. So
makes sense.
I totally understand that this would not be a scenario where you give access to everyone in your tenant, but yeah.
So, yeah, the other options are already there in the CLI without the need of waiting for a couple of minutes to get feedback. So
yeah. Yeah, so apparently I was too late refreshing. It already ran and it already deleted the Azure Container instance. But what you will see is that it ran for 6 times. So I can move to the 6th run because that's the final run. And after that, it deleted everything. And what I can see is 4, 5, 6. Okay, yeah, there we go. So what I can do, I can see the get logs, and what I actually got is, here you can see that I got the raw output with just a bunch of JSON for all those sites with my email address, what the settings for those sites are, what the URLs are, and it's a bash script. So you can do custom filtering, you can do custom sorting, stuff like that, or you can just say, I'm going to pull everything into my logic app, parse the JSON in my logic app, and I don't know, send an email saying, hey, these 3 sites have problems, or these 3 flows are no longer with an owner, stuff like that. And part of it is things that you can already do with the CLI. So with the CLI, you can already send emails, you can concatenate complex reports. The thing is, the CLI was always running locally, always running on your machine. And with running it in an Azure Container instance, you can schedule it saying, okay, give me a report every month of what's happening in my tenant.
Cool.
With that, questions?
You have all the connectors as well in Logic App, so you can also say, post all my erroring sites or something to Twitter. I wouldn't do that, but it's entirely possible, of course.
Or to a Teams channel.
Teams channel or Excel file even. So the possibilities are endless.
And you can do things like, okay, the CLI does allow you to do or does allow you to post adaptive cards, but that expects you to understand some JSON. what if you don't understand JSON? You can use the Logic App adaptive cards part without writing any code to just post a result set saying, okay, these sites are broken. Here you have an adaptive card to fix them. Or here you have an adaptive card to go to the admin center and delete the sites that you think should be deleted.
Or if you're not good at scripting, you can create a logic here. If everything goes okay, then do nothing or send an email. But if something goes wrong here, then do this. Otherwise, do this. Trigger another logic app, and you can build an entire workflow onto it that cleans your environment every week or something.
Yeah. Now what we did is we pulled in a bash script coming from my GitHub repo. But as you can see here, we do have a bunch of sample scripts like govern orphaned Microsoft Teams. And you can just go here, copy paste either the PowerShell or the bash, doesn't really matter. Post it into any location that you like, pull it into your container, execute it, and you're done. So even if you might not be really good at scripting, or you're just it's your first time scripting, you can just copy paste a sample script and get the results into your Logic App and go from there.
Yeah, we do it a few times for if you have to transfer it to something. If, let's say people hire us to do something, we can do it either in a script, but then we have to explain somebody who probably doesn't know how scripts work. This is what it does, and you have to learn them how to write scripts actually. But in a Logic App, it's very easy for people who are not that tech savvy to say, okay, see, step 1 does this, step 2 does this. Okay, you don't need to. If the step is really broken, call us. But as long as you can see what went wrong somewhere, it already fixes 60% of the problem sometimes. So
totally makes sense.
Can make it even in a way that you say something like, okay, I have a SharePoint list, and based on a new item, and the item has a drop-down field of, okay, wanna get all teams without 2 owners, and that starts a special script because okay, Logic App kicks in, gets the parameter, and knows what to execute and gets back.
Yeah.
And because of the container, it's always the latest version of the CLI, which is also good if something has an issue or something. Nice.
Cool. And for me, it was the first time.
Where did you host the container? The container is hosted on Docker then.
Yeah. So if you create a new Azure Logic App, if you create a new Azure Container instance, it will actually walk you through. So let me quickly get the container instance. Loading. I don't know what I did to deserve this, but it's really freaking slow.
Azure burned down. Azure burned down twice this month already. In the last 2 months. So please, not a third time. I cannot take it anymore. If it's burning down now, I'm turning off my phone. I'm done with it.
Okay.
But if Azure AD goes down, you're not gonna be bothered in Teams anyways.
Yeah.
No, that's true.
That also helps. That also helps.
Okay. What are they running on this page?
Bitcoin miners.
Bitcoin, in your browser.
Yeah. Okay, so I don't know what I did wrong. I'm gonna give up. This is not gonna work. Basically, if you create an Azure Container instance, you can either pick something from the public public Docker registry. You can pick up something from a private repository, whatever you fancy for hosting your containers, or you can pick something from the Azure Container registry. So you've got the 3 options. But the CLI one is put into Docker because it's a Docker container. Makes more sense for us. And you can run it locally if you want, or just run it on Azure.
And because it's on Docker, it's public, people can see what's in it, so they can also verify that it's just installing the CLI. There's nothing happening to your tenant, no data is sent nowhere to Microsoft or who's using it, or just an installment of the CLI latest version. done.
Yeah,
Well, potentially you could even do virtual networking where you'd say, okay, I want this Docker container to only be allowed in my VNet, only be allowed to communicate to Office 365, my tenant, nothing else. We do send telemetry data to PMP, but that's only what commands are being used. We don't log anything else. But if you block it, everything will still work. You won't get any exceptions. You can even set a global setting. I don't want to send telemetry data if you don't want to.
Yeah, okay, but that's normal. If I would build something, I would also want just the numbers of how many people are using it.
Yeah, we want to know if things are breaking.
Yeah. And of course, how many people are using it. If you're building it for 2 people, then maybe put effort in something else. But
shouldn't you? I have no real experience with Docker, but shouldn't you be able to also create your own Docker image based on the CLI one and maybe add your scripts already on that level? So in your Logic app, you won't need to fiddle around with GitHub and pulling in a script. But let's say, okay, I define an image with, I don't know, 20 standard scripts, and you just provide a script name as a parameter, and without any need to pull data in from GitHub, you can call those scripts because they're built in the image.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And your developers can build scripts and build the containers, and the admins can use the containers.
Yeah.
Which is not a DevOps world, but that's another story. That's another story. And this costs the cost price of this peanuts, no? Cents.
I don't know. I think I spent €2 getting this to work, but as you can see, I think I did 200 runs before I got everything to work. And that had to do with the fact that I'm not really a Linux guy. So just mounting a hard disk, running a script from a mounted hard disk took me 20 runs to figure out, okay, what's the command? What's the mount point? Is it actually mounted, or do I still need to instantiate stuff? And then I needed another 20 to 25 runs to get a proper script running, and then another 20 to 50 runs to get authentication in place, because the first 50 runs were you're not authenticated yet. I was I'm pretty sure I am, but that's that had more to do with the fact that it was new to me than with the CLI not working or things like that.
Of course, yeah.
It's always with new technology.
And I think that a run like this, I don't know, it will probably take a cent or 2 cents, and that's it. And if it's not running, then it won't cost you anything. I think a Logic app is built per run. It might be that managed identity. Yeah, so the Logic app doesn't cost anything if you don't run it. The managed identity might cost you a little bit if you create it, not sure. No. And then I created 2 API connections just to test stuff, but you would only need 1 API connection. There you get, and that's free as well if you're not using it. You only pay for it if you do the connections.
Yeah, the cool thing is if you take the container, because of the managed identity, you run it locally. It runs under your credentials. So you can even test it with your credentials. You have access to site AB. Okay, site AB, you run it on, and then the managed identity has access to the entire tenant. So you can test it perfectly and see if it works, and then do it for everything else where you don't have access.
Then scale up with the other identity. Yeah, that's true.
Cool. Nice stuff.
I think that's it for tonight. No more demos.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah, fun to play around with. It rekindled my energy for Docker containers.
Yeah, and I saw your command line. I thought, I want so I already looked up how to get the GitHub back into my command line, the master branch with the colors and all that stuff. So
yeah, that's cool. Cool. That's it for tonight then.
Nice.
See you guys next time.
See you guys next time.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Make sure to check out the show notes at selectedtech.show to get all the mentioned references. And one more thing, please tweet about the podcast and give them a 5-star review. This really helps the guys a lot. Thank you and see you next time. Bye.